Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. As reptile keeping has become more and more popular over the last few decades, there have been numerous reptile products to come on the market. Some of these products are excellent, some of them are just okay, and some of them are really horrible and should not be used under any circumstances. Today I'm going to count down my list of 10 reptile supplies that you should avoid. So if you were thinking of buying any of these supplies, or if you already have them and were thinking of using them, perhaps you should think twice about that. I'm going to count down my list in approximate order of the absolute worst to the not quite so bad. And some of these supplies, I would say that they shouldn't be used under any circumstances by any reptile keeper for any reptile. Others are appropriate under certain circumstances, but there are definitely better options available. The first item on my list may be the most infamous product in the history of herpetoculture, and that is called the hot rock. This is actually not a real hot rock because I threw away all my hot rocks about 3 decades ago, but this is exactly what a hot rock looks like. You basically have a flat, artificial type of rock, and you have an electric cord that goes into the rock. And the operation is pretty simple. You plug it in, it heats up, it heats the reptile. So there are a couple problems with this thing. The first is that this type of concept of reptiles lying on hot rocks to get warm only applies to certain types of reptiles. For example, a lizard in a desert might lie on a rock to warm itself up. And this, of course, does not apply to boa constrictors. They don't lie on hot rocks to warm up. But by far the biggest problem with this thing is that there's no temperature control at all. You just plug it in and it heats up, and these things, basically most of the surface would be stone cold, but there's just a few small areas of the rock which are slightly cooler than the surface of the sun. So this is something I would use under no circumstances whatsoever for any reptile. I would not recommend it. I was amazed to discover that they're actually still selling these things on the internet. So really bad product. I've heard stories about iguanas that have gotten their back legs burned off by these things, and definitely wouldn't recommend it. Incidentally, another word for the hot rock is the sizzle stone, and I guess it's appropriate of a name because you could literally hear the sizzle of the burning flesh of any reptile unfortunate enough to have this in its cage. Item number 2 is another one that I would recommend under absolutely no circumstances, and that's called the pinky pump. And this is a device that can be used for force feeding snakes that won't eat. So it's basically a metal syringe with a glass barrel, and it's got this little nozzle that's inserted into the throat of the snake, and then you put a pinky or two, little pinky mouse, into the barrel, and then you squeeze. And there's this little metal grate right here at the end of the tip of the syringe, and that basically liquefies the mouse into this horrific milkshake-like concoction. And then that's injected into the throat of the snake. So there's a number of problems with this. The first is if your snake won't eat, especially a boa, typically you have some kind of husbandry error, or the snake hasn't been properly acclimated. And any calories you can get into the snake with this thing are going to, the damage that you do is much worse than the positive effects of those calories. So at the very least, you're going to do considerable psychological damage to your snake by having this thing shoved down his throat. And you quite likely will do physical damage as well. Because when you squeeze it, you have to put a lot of pressure to grind up that mouse. The mouse milkshake is shot out at a very high velocity, which is likely to damage your snake's throat. So just a really horrific item. I would not recommend this for any purpose. There are much less damaging ways to assist feed snakes, like using a mouse tail that's been lubricated with chicken egg, for example. So any positive effects from the calories are going to be far outweighed by the harm that you would do with this pinky pump. So while we're talking about feeding snakes, this brings us to item number 3 to avoid, and that is a pre-packaged frozen feeder rodent from your local pet shop. And so many years ago I had a baby snake I needed a mouse for. This was before I bred my own. And I went down to the pet shop to try to buy a live mouse. This is one of the national chain pet shops. I'm sure you can probably guess which one it was. So even though they sold ball pythons and corn snakes, which are obviously mouse eaters, they refused to sell me a live mouse when I made the mistake of telling them I was going to feed it to my snake. Not quite sure of the logic there. But they directed me towards the back, and there was this freezer with these pre-packaged frozen rodents in little plastic bags. There was like a brand name, I don't even remember what it was. But I got that mouse home, opened it up, and it was just the horrific smell, the advanced state of decomposition. This is something I would never try to feed to my snake. So obviously I never went back and bought another one. And I've had several other people tell me that they've had a similar experience. So don't buy the prepackaged frozen feeder rodents from your neighborhood chain pet store. The fourth product to avoid concerns your choice of substrate. 2 substrates I would absolutely never use for a boa constrictor are cedar chips or pine shavings. So these types of wood contain aromatic chemicals which are toxic to reptiles. And although there's a little bit of controversy with some people claiming to have used these without any health damage, there's enough negative opinions out there that I wouldn't even try using these. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I've been successful using aspen shavings as well as coconut husk bedding and orchid bark, which is like a cypress bark mulch. And these are all fine for using as a substrate for boa constrictors. But I wouldn't use any wood like pine or cedar that has that really strong aromatic smell to it. The next item I would avoid at all costs is any kind of bulb that's used as a heat source. I've seen these pictures online of these poor boas that have a 100-watt bulb in their enclosure, and the bulb is putting out all kinds of heat and light, and the boa has to be right underneath the bulb. So any kind of bulb is going to be way too hot, and it's going to put out too much light for a boa constrictor. In addition, these bulbs also have a drying effect. They cause the enclosure to be way too dry, and your boa needs to have humidity in order for health and proper shedding. So this, obviously, just a white light bulb is not appropriate to put in a boa's enclosure. I'm talking about like a white incandescent type of light bulb as a heat source. But other bulbs like the red spotlight bulbs or even these ceramic heating elements, they all get way too hot and they dry out the enclosure way too much for a boa constrictor. You can use certain types of fluorescent lighting if you want to have light for your boa, but the light shouldn't be the heat source for your boa constrictor. These bulbs are also can pose a fire hazard. So those 5 items I would avoid at all costs. The next 5 items on my list might be used under certain circumstances, but I feel that there are better alternatives, especially when it comes to boa constrictors. And the first of these items are sexing probes. And so I find that to sex boa constrictors, it's a lot easier and more accurate to use a palpation method where you feel underneath the tail for the presence of the hemipenes in a baby boa. And I described this method in my previous video entitled How to Sex Your Boa. In addition, you can sex adult boas pretty easily just by visually examining the tail. The males will have a longer, thicker tail, and they'll also have the presence of large vestigial spurs, whereas females will have a shorter, not as thick tail, and the spurs will be very, very small if they're even present. The next item that I will avoid is heating cable to heat racks instead of using a heat tape like the FlexWatt heat tape. So I have this Vision Boa rack that has 8 shelves, and it comes with 2 heating cables. Each of the heating cables is 50 feet long. And you have to thread the heating cable through each shelf in just the right manner so you have enough heating cable on each shelf for the right temperature. But the problem is that hot air rises, so you need more heat cable per shelf on the bottom and less on the top. And so the 50-foot piece, you might want to have like 15 feet on the bottom and then like 12 feet and then 10 feet, etc. But the problem is that I find it really tricky to get the right amount of cable on each shelf to give me the right temperatures. And the bottom shelves are always a few degrees below the top shelves. It's also very labor intensive to reset the heating cable because you have to disassemble the rack and pull it all out and then put everything back. Because you have just one 50-foot heating cable that controls 4 shelves, you can only use one thermostat probe. So you can't individually control the temperatures on each shelf. And that's a major drawback with this heating cable. So in the future, I will only use a heat tape like the Flex White heat tape to heat my racks rather than using heating cable. The next product to be cautious about is called the JumpStart. This is a heat mat controlling thermostat, and they can be used in some cases for reptile thermostats. They're developed to control the temperature of heat mats to start seeds of things like tomatoes and cannabis and other things that people like to grow. But the problem is that they control the temperature in a range. Basically, it's an on-off type of thermostat. And when the temperature gets below a certain point, the power comes on. When it gets above a certain point, the power goes off. So you can't really precisely control the temperature of your reptile with this particular solution. The other issue is that these things are not really dependable and they will fail without warning. They can last a year, they can last 3 years, they might even last 5 years, but then they just suddenly give out with no warning. And there is a 50% chance it's going to fail in the on position and all the power will be let through. So if you have an unregulated heat mat, depending on your rack setup, the tub can get to over 130 degrees. And I've heard numerous stories about people losing lots of snakes. They get killed by the excess heat when the thermostat fails. They can also be a huge fire hazard. So if you're going to use one of these, be really cautious. Check on it a lot. Do not plug more than one heat mat at a time into one of these. And as soon as you have the money to afford a better solution like Herbstat, I would recommend that you get rid of this thing. So the second to last item that I would avoid are using fish tanks for snake cages for boas. And so I know a lot of people go absolutely ballistic if someone asks about a fish tank because they think it's like the worst thing ever invented. I would say that a fish tank could potentially be used as a boa enclosure as long as you provide the right temperature range, the right humidity, and enough hiding places. However, it's a lot harder to provide these with a fish tank because fish tanks don't hold the temperature very well. They don't hold humidity very well. In addition, they're very heavy, they're very fragile, you can't stack them. So there's a number of disadvantages. So if you have to start off with your boa in a fish tank, it might be okay for a while as long as you provide all of the proper requirements for the environmental conditions. But I would recommend that you try to upgrade to a cage designed for a boa when you can afford that solution. The last item on my list of products to avoid is a plexiglass fronted snake cage. And I've had a few plexiglass fronted cages, and even from the beginning the plexiglass is not quite as transparent as just regular glass, so you can't see the snake quite as well through it. And then within a few years they get horribly scratched up and to the point where you can barely see the snake at all. They're also a lot harder to keep clean than just regular glass. So in the future I will only be buying a glass fronted snake cage. I actually have some glass fronted cages that are decades old and the glass still looks fine. This is compared to some plexiglass fronted cages that are less than a decade old and they're almost to the point where I need to throw them away. To end the video, This is my 2015 boa constrictor longicauda female. This is a long-tailed boa. And so these boas are characterized by becoming increasingly darker and darker as they age. They start off relatively light, and then with each shed they get more melanin. And so this animal is almost an adult. You can see she's got this beautiful black and brown coloration. The face markings are really beautiful. They have these gorgeous dark side stripes and this beautiful dark stripe on their head. No other boa constrictor looks like this. This is actually my favorite longicauda. I have two pairs of them, and actually I have a pair of breed that I'm trying to breed right now, so fingers crossed that I'll have some babies in a few months. This girl potentially would be ready to pair up next year, so we'll just have to see how that goes. But I really enjoyed watching this animal mature and watching her get her beautiful adult coloration. So I hope this video was helpful. If you think that I missed some items that are on your list of the top 10 worst products ever for reptiles, please comment below. Or if you don't agree with some of my picks and you've used these items and you like them, please comment below. I want to hear everyone's experiences. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.